Lynn, who's a paralegal also with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. So if you could give them a warm welcome, please. And they will now review these State versus James Foley and State versus Karen Foley. So take it away.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess I'll take the mic. My name is Brian Townsend II. I'm an Assistant Attorney General with the New Hampshire Department of Justice. I recently took over the Elder Abuse and Financial Exploitation Unit back in June, so pretty fresh to me. Before that, it was run by an attorney named Brandon Garrod, who some of you might know. Our unit started up about three and a half years ago now, so Sonny's been with it the entire time. I've been with the Office of the Department of Justice for 3.5, almost 4 years. Before elder abuse, I did Medicaid fraud for 3 years, and I bet some of you are wondering what the heck does Medicaid fraud have to do with elder abuse? What a lot of people don't know is that Medicaid fraud control units, and they're just about all over the country in just about every Department of Justice, they have jurisdiction over elder abuse and financial exploitation occurring in facilities, board and care facilities. That includes Medicaid funded facilities and non-Medicaid funded facilities. So when I got into my role, into my position in Medicaid fraud, we were getting referrals from Adult Protective Services. I was wondering why. I found out we had jurisdiction over those cases, and I took over some of those cases, prosecuted, investigated both physical abuse of elderly in those facilities and financial exploitation. So I will let Sunny introduce herself at this point.
Good morning, everybody. Sunny Mulligan. I am a former attorney, and then I came to the bright side of victim witness advocacy. So I've had a lot of experience in advocating, but my advocacy started, in fact, with children who are victims of sexual assault and getting them through the court system. I've been a professor at a law school. I've done a variety of things. But then came back to advocacy with the county attorney in Hillsborough County, New Hampshire. And then this invitation came to work with the Attorney General's office as a victim witness advocate. And I have to tell you, it feels like full circle has come for me, from our most vulnerable children to our most vulnerable adults. So I've been there, as Brian said, 3.5 years. Brandon and I were the first people who did it. And when Paul was talking about sitting in the unit going, where's the cases, where's the cases? Well, Brandon and I were housed in the Consumer Protection Bureau, and we'd go to our staff meetings and we'd be talking about car fraud and stuff. And Brandon and I'd be looking at each other going, what the hell are we doing here? And finally, we had to do exactly what Paul talked about. We reached out to APS. The Adult Protective Services, we went to every police chief's meeting in the state. We did anything to let people know, yeah, we're here and we're serious and we want to prosecute these cases. So as the victim witness advocate, and Brandon and I, my job obviously was to make sure we were complying with the Victims' Bill of Rights. And I was saying to Tori at the break, it's so lovely to hear Paul talking, because if nothing else, in some ways it assures us that we're actually doing okay. We're doing some of the right stuff. When he talked about unwilling victims, I had one little lady who I worked with. She was a victim of exploitation at the hands of her daughter-in-law. And for a year, I went to her house and I drank cups of tea in her kitchen. And finally, she didn't really want to talk to the police. And I finally said, why don't you want to talk to the police? They're here to help you. And she says, I'm not that kind of a family. The police don't come to our house. And so I said, okay, let's get past that one. So we invited the police officer. She agreed that she would be willing to talk to him and meet with him. And so we started that work of, just getting her to know that we were there for her, and it wasn't a family matter. It wasn't a civil matter, and that we were taking it seriously, and we really just wanted to take care of her. So in my work with victims, a lot of what I'm doing is just winning over their faith, letting them know that it's going to be okay, and we're going to sit beside them throughout this process. And I have walked little old ladies in arm, let me tell you, to the courthouse, mainly because they had difficulty walking or were not so steady on their feet. So I've walked some of those paths, and it's been an amazing journey. So I'm going to hand it over now to Bob Freitas, our investigator. go through this presentation, we'll talk about the collaborations we've had as this team and with outside resources, including APS, Medicare, all sorts of folks.
Morning, everybody. My name is Bob Freitas. I'm a criminal investigator assigned with the New Hampshire Department of Justice, and my assignment right now is to the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. And I've been with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit for entering my 6th year now. Prior to that, I was a police officer in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I retired back in 2009. And I got the great opportunity by the Department of Justice to work for the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Did that for about 6 years. It was fascinating, probably some of the best time that I spent in my law enforcement career, until they offered me a full-time position working within the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Now, when I got that call, I had no idea what the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit was, but it was a very, very good opportunity for a nice job after retirement, so I snapped it up, not knowing what I was getting myself into. And like I tell everybody that I talk with about this particular unit, is that from my career and what I had done for over 30 years, this is a completely different animal. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and I can honestly tell you, entering my 6th year now, I am just starting to get comfortable with dealing with these particular cases, and they are complicated, and like Paul said, they do scare law enforcement because they're either overwhelmed or have no idea how to investigate these things. And a lot of them are very simple, and with today's technology, and we'll talk about this within this case study, you know, that information is available to you. It's really easy to get, and it just hits a home run in a lot of these cases that we deal with. So with that, I'm going to introduce Samantha Zinn. Samantha is our paralegal in the office, and she's our lady that gets all the stuff done for court and makes everything easy for everybody to understand.
Well, he just summed it up for me. I am the paralegal for the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, and I've only been with the unit for 2 years. I have no background in IT, but what I found was that the technology used in the courtroom is very helpful in creating persuasive presentations that really help juries kind of understand the information, especially when we have cases that are very heavy in documents. We had over 4,000 pages for this. 8,000 pages for this case alone. And so my job as part of the trial team was kind of helping the attorneys manage all those documents through the trial director system, and we also use PowerPoint. So there's a lot of different technology out there that can be used for trial, and we've certainly used a lot of it.
So I was really happy to see where Paul left off, because I think it's a smooth transition into our presentation, which is it's a team effort. FAST recognizes that anyone who works these cases, whether it's the U.S. Department of Justice, whether it's Vermont's Department of Justice, everyone understands that to bring these cases forward, it takes a team. It takes outside agencies, other individuals' reports, real collaboration. So what I wanted to do in this presentation today was show you what that looks like in a case, from the investigation phase to prosecution and even after prosecution. What that looks like, what people do, what we ask people to do in terms of reporting, and just about everything in between. So State versus James Foley and State versus Karen Foley was the first case that I got handed when I started in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit 3.5 years ago. It was just at sort of the beginning of its investigation phase at that time, and so we had trial, full joint trial of both James and Karen, who were husband and wife, last November, and it ended in 2 guilty verdicts. It was a very difficult case because, as Paul described, we had a victim who, when we found out about the allegations, she had really severe dementia. There was absolutely no chance that she was going to be able to testify or really explain the way she had been financially exploited. So we had to proceed down other avenues, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I wanted to start with really the most important person in this case, which is the victim. That's Barbara McEnany, and I'll have Sunny tell you a little bit about Barbara.
I was born in 1934. She was single for most of her life, but she met the love of her life and her husband when she was much older, and his name was Charles, or as she called him, Chuck. She had no children. He, however, had 5 children. So this was an interesting part for us. She developed dementia around Parkinson's, and in 2006, her husband Chuck became quite ill. So he was no longer able to take care of her in her Parkinson's, as he had to go into a nursing home. So she went into an assisted living facility in New Hampshire. Shortly thereafter, she moved to a different one, which is where our story came to life. But she was, by all accounts, from everybody who knew her, she was a very intelligent lady, read a lot, was a very frugal woman, but basically loved by the facility where she finally ended her days. And another part of this is, as we got into the prosecution, she not only had Parkinson's, but before we got to court, she died. So we went forward, as Paul talked about, with a case where our victim was no longer alive.
So as Sunny just mentioned, from everyone we talked to who spoke about Barbara, something kept coming up, and that was she was frugal. She was as frugal as they come. And this was actually a chart that we introduced at trial as we went through her banking records. She spent next to nothing on retail. She would be hard-pressed to even buy herself a pair of Velcro sneakers. And she would do it on occasion, but this represents just kind of how her spending broke down from January 2010 to September 2011, while she was the sole owner of her bank account. And we'll get to the point at which she no longer became the sole owner of her bank account, and that becomes important. But as you can see here, she spent about 90% of all her funds on housing. So she was in an assisted living facility. She had the Parkinson's, which was pretty debilitating, but she was able to still manage her own bank account. So she would write checks. She never had a debit card. She never had a credit card. She did everything by check. And 8% there was medical expenses, for which Medicare would not cover. And then we have retail, less than 1% during that about 18-month period. And it was less than $500 she spent over 18 months, and about the majority of that was gift baskets that she would purchase for staff at her prior facility. Cash she took out rarely. We're talking about maybe $300 the entire time, that entire 18-month time period. Really, she spent by check. She wrote checks for everything. And then charity, less than 1%. She gave every once in a while, but really when she did, she gave $10 at a time. So Salvation Army, the local church, $10 checks each time. So a few things to note. In September 2011, and that's really where that graph leaves off, some important things happened for Barbara. The assisted living facility in which she was living closed down, so she needed to move somewhere else. So she moves into a new assisted living facility in that same town, but it was private pay. So her prior facility was private pay. This place was a little nicer. When she did so, she had about $170,000 in savings. So that's between checking accounts, savings accounts, and CDs. But she also had monthly income of about $2,000. So conservatively, this would have allowed her to stay in the facility for about 5 to 6 years before the funds were exhausted. And typically what the facility said was that when they would take someone in on private pay, they would kind of analyze the amount of funds they had and then make a determination, okay, is this the type of person that if they come in here and their funds are exhausted, we'll let them stay. They kind of made that decision up front, but it wasn't guaranteed. They had the authority to say, no, you need to find somewhere else to live once the funds were all exhausted. So her stay there was not guaranteed. And when she moved in, the type of living situation that she had was consistent with her being frugal. She moved into one of the smallest units. They had some with big kitchenettes and things like that. They had multi-bedrooms. She moved into one of the smallest units, no kitchenette, moved all of her old things in, didn't buy really anything new, no new bedding, no new sheets, none of that. So August 2013, we fast forward less than 2 years later, she has $777.54 to her name. So the question becomes, what happened, right? Did she suddenly decide that she was going to go and buy herself new and expensive things? Did she take some of those cruises that Paul talked about? The answer is no, she didn't. This is James Foley and Karen Foley. And James is Barbara's younger brother. He's much younger, so younger by about 16 years. They never really had much of a relationship growing up. Because of that age gap, he really comes back into her life much later, right around the time that Barbara's husband, Chuck, gets sick and then passes away. We talked to a bunch of the stepchildren, and the way they described it was, in about that 2006-2007 time period, the stepchildren get involved. James comes around and they say, "Hey James, you kind of take care of your sister. We'll take care of Chuck." And they sort of went their separate ways. This is Karen, James's wife, and they lived in Bennington, New Hampshire, which was about 30 minutes north of where Barbara was staying at Summerhill Assisted Living. The assisted living facility she moved into in September 2011. So James, Paul talked a lot about powers of attorney. So in 2006, when Barbara originally went to a facility, she gave James a power of attorney over her finances. She also named him power of attorney for health care as well, but that didn't trigger until much later. So this was a broad power of attorney. It was a durable power of attorney. It even said in it that it had broad and sweeping powers to act on her behalf. But the biggest thing that was in there was an acknowledgement that he signed that said, when you do so, you are a fiduciary and you have to act in Barbara's best interest. One more thing about James. When she moves into the facility in September of 2011, the new facility, she actually adds him to the bank account. She makes him a full co-owner of her bank account. And we talked about all those myths. Paul talked about all those myths for law enforcement. Well, one thing that we've heard from law enforcement is, well, if they're on the account, then they can do pretty much whatever they want. They can take whatever they want. I will say that in some jurisdictions, that's the case. In New Hampshire, it's not. A co-owner of a bank account can be held criminally responsible for stealing money from another co-owner. I'm not sure the way that is in Vermont. I haven't had a chance to check yet, but that can happen if one co-owner uses the funds in a way that is contrary to the agreement that they've had. So husband and wife on an account, if the agreement really is, hey, use this for personal expenses, husband can't just take it out and flee the country. That's theft. So this just shows you what it looked like after James became the co-signer. After he became the co-signer, he got a debit card. And from everyone we talked to, including the defendants themselves, they stated that the reason they got a debit card was to help Barbara with necessities. So they weren't always able to go to the facility and take Barbara out to where she needed to go. So really it was, hey, you need something at Walgreens, you need us to pick you up something, we'll use the debit card for that only. There's another important date, April of 2012. So in April of 2012, there was an address change on the bank account. And it changed from Summerhill Assisted Living to where Barbara was getting those statements and doing her own finances to James and Karen's house in Bennington. So the statements would no longer be sent to Barbara, they would be sent directly to James and Karen. And there's another important date that isn't on this graph, and that's where it kind of spikes up right there. That represents August of 2012. And in August of 2012, a very important thing happens, and that is that Barbara is taken to her primary care doctor, and she complains for the first time that she's having short-term memory problems. And so those are the initial symptoms of what would turn into a very severe, very advanced case of dementia. And so by the end there, Very short time period, less than, really from where that August of 2012 is, it's really a 1-year period where you see that very sharp decline in funds. So how is it, so we get that information, how is it that this turns into this? So husband and wife sentenced for stealing $90,000 from a relative in assisted living facility. And this is where the team approach becomes so important. We didn't have Barbara. So obstacles, and Paul talked about a lot of them. We didn't have Barbara. She wasn't competent, and like Sunny said, by the time the case came around, she had passed away. So she had passed away for about a year before the case was tried. James was a power of attorney with broad and sweeping powers. James was also a co-owner in the account. So that's where this team approach comes in. Everybody doing their part to bring the facts to light and ultimately to prosecute the case. And there are really 4 players here. The first is the facility administrators, who did an absolutely amazing job of taking care of Barbara in the first instance. And then number 2, talking with James and Karen, asking where the money went. Talking with other employees of the facility. Hey, did you see anything? What's going on? And we'll talk about some important things that came to light as a result of that. The Medicaid office. They played a role in this case, and we'll go into a little more depth about that. But after after James and Karen spent all of Barbara's money, they tried to take her out of the facility because the facility was asking too many questions for their liking. And so they tried to sign her up for Medicaid. And Medicaid has, I'm sure some of you know, a 5-year look back where they review all financial statements for 5 years, and they also ask questions, which was really helpful. Both the facility and the Medicaid office were so concerned about what they heard and what they saw that they referred the case to Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services in New Hampshire, who did a thorough and really incredible investigation in this case. Got statements from both of the defendants that really went a long way in helping our investigation and prosecution. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we did, how we investigated further, and how we ultimately tried the case and made things a little simpler by use of technology. So I'm going to ask Sunny to talk a little bit about the facility and what they did.
So the facility were amazing. Mary Pat was our key person there, and she was absolutely wonderful. She really cared about Barbara, was very concerned about her, but they also had this very, very caring staff, and that came through very loud and clear, particularly as we prepared for trial. So they would just keep eyes on what was going on for Barbara. And they would ask the questions, and those questions, as Brian said, became critical for us. One of the beautiful statements was, not sure where the money went, guess we weren't so careful. That meant a lot to us. But mostly they reported to bees. In New Hampshire we have a mandatory reporting law if you suspect abuse of an elder person. And there they had major concerns, and when they saw them, they reported without hesitation. And their contribution also became very critical as we went forward in trial, because they had to work with us. We took more time out of their staff and their facility by preparing them, and they willingly met with us. They willingly gave their time. They willingly were at trial for a couple of days, sitting in our courtroom lobbies. They just cooperated in every step of the way. And by the way, for these 4 facilities, when they're there reporting and cooperating with us, they're getting smeared on the news. They're getting smeared in the newspapers. They're hearing, exploitation of an elder person at Summerhill. Well, you know what? The one that they did everything they were meant to do. And so there's always this reluctance, by the way, with facilities on reporting, because this is what happens, is they report and they become the limelight in these cases. These guys did not shy away from it. They took it and they worked with us, and they were absolutely wonderful. But as a victim witness, of course, throughout it, every time something happened, I was calling the facility and saying, here's the update, here's what's going on. So they've remained engaged with us. This went on for a long time, this case. And we wanted them to remain engaged, we wanted them to remain invested. And in doing that, what we're doing again is building up those relationships and making sure they wanted to work with continue to feel like this was important, continue to feel like they had a big role in it, and they did.
So one of the other important things that happened here is that when Mary Pat went and talked to staff, and she talked to just about every staff member who interacted with Barbara, one of the staff members came forward and said that there was a strange interaction that happened with Karen Foley, where she was around the corner of Barbara's room one day and she heard Karen yelling at Barbara saying, "Sign the check, just sign it." So that staff member walked into the room, and then Karen was acting really suspiciously. She grabbed the checkbook really fast, she put it in her pocket or pocketbook, and kind of just walked right out of the room. So that was helpful to us. That statement didn't end up coming in trial, but by hearing that, we knew we were on the right track. The last statement there, not sure where the money went, but we weren't careful, that came up right about the time that they were applying for Medicaid. So, Mary Pat, just by asking questions, was able to get that statement, which was very helpful for us in trial. It shows that they had some responsibility to act on her behalf and that they played a role in draining her funds. So as I said before, the second part of this is the New Hampshire Medicaid office. And their role really comes in the fact that James just wanted the questions from the administrators to stop, so he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take her out of the facility, I'm going to try and get her into a new facility on the state dime, and then maybe the questions will stop then. But lucky for us, Medicaid did a great job of continuing to ask questions, and they were able to get some helpful information. So as I said before, Medicaid does a 5-year look back. So most people don't know about this. Most people in this room know about it, but most people don't who are going to sign up for Medicaid. And when they're told about it, they're a little shocked. So the Medicaid worker that we called at trial told a story about the first interaction that she had with James and Karen. So by that point, Barbara has severe dementia. She can no longer manage her finances. They can't really ask her any questions. So James is doing all of the talking. Karen's doing all of the talking for Barbara. So the worker says and tells them at the first meeting, there's going to be a 5-year look back. And she described the looks on their faces. And she said it was one of surprise. It was one of nervousness. And then they became real chatty and just started rambling and stopped answering any of our questions. So that was another telltale sign for us that they were doing something wrong. This right here is something that our New Hampshire Medicaid office does. I'm not sure if other offices do it. It's called a look-back log. So what they do is they go through and they identify any questionable spending that's either a gift that's not in line with prior spending, things like that. Something that would disqualify them from receiving Medicaid services. So they identified really 3 categories of spending that they were concerned about, all after that kind of August of 2012 time period that Barbara gets dementia. And the first is more than $20,000 in ATM cash withdrawals that show up after that time period. This is a look-back log that speaks to that. The other is more than $20,000 in retail spending at different places such as Bed Bath & Beyond, Target, Amazon, things of that nature, that they're saying, this wasn't there 5 years ago when Barbara was the sole owner of her account. What's going on? And then the last category was $50,000 withdrawal in March of 2013, shortly before Barbara goes into the unit for dementia at the facility. So what you see here is the look-back log. She sends this to James and Karen. She says, hey, if you can explain this, please explain it. We just want to know what's going on here. So this is September 2012, and we see in May of 2013, that's about 14 transactions, all of $800 withdrawals from ATMs. So that's a little over $10,000 altogether. And so the way they explained it was just sort of generally cash for her. And then they come up with this idea, okay, let's deflect She told us it was her money. She could spend it on what she wanted. It was Christmas gifts to her 5 stepchildren. One of the important parts to know, and we interviewed all 5 stepchildren, they hadn't really spoken to her in years. And again, this is a person who never really took out much of any money whatsoever from ATM. She never had a debit card. And then it gets even better because we have March 2013. James and Karen, we tried to tell her to slow down with her money, so she spread it out a little bit for the step-grandchildren and stepchildren. So again, it's really about asking questions. It's this idea of the team approach. They really helped us out because they locked them in on their statements as to what they did with it. So what they also did, and this was helpful for us as well, is James and Karen got so sick of things that these look-back logs, they said, okay, maybe we'll just print out the statements and we'll just write general explanations on the bank statements. So as you can see, we have a bunch of different things. We have Amazon purchases, we have Walmart purchases, Walmart Shaw's, things like that. So they started writing explanations right on the statements, and this one says, Walmart, I took her and she had fun just spending money. Don't remember what she bought. We were able to get her medical records too. And this purchase here from Walmart where she had fun just spending money happened to be the day after she was using her walker. She fell, she hit her head, and she had to crawl on the ground to get staff to notice what happened. So the next day apparently she had fun just spending money. This is another one. So this shows the explanation for the March 2013 $50,000. It was Jim's early inheritance. So that was his explanation. Barbara said, you know what, I don't need the money anymore, even though she was at a private pay facility. I'm just going to give it all to you, and you can spend it on whatever you want, which he used to build an automotive garage, because he was a big hot rod guy. He would build hot rods. So she said, money's better with you building hot rods as opposed to my care. So there's also some other things on there, explanation, Amazon Prime, so she had free shipping, and another general explanation, basically things she wanted for herself and others. I'll pass it off to Sunny.
The Bureau of Elder and Adult Services, when we started the unit, we knew that we were going to have to be reaching out to them. One, because you know what, we had no cases and we were losing our minds. But we did also want to collaborate because obviously they're the front line. They see a lot of this. So we started building our relationships with them. That included inviting them to teach at the police academy with us so that when we're talking to law enforcement, they understand what it is the Bureau are doing, they understand what it is we are doing, and they understand how there's a real disconnect at times, but there's a real connect at times. So we wanted them to understand all of that. So when this case came to light, we already had those relationships built. We were very familiar with the social worker who went out and did all of his investigation. We knew exactly what he had done. He would call into Brian to chat about his investigation and say, hey, here's where I'm at. And he was sharing throughout the investigation. And Brian would check with him to see how's it going, how's your investigation, how are you coming along. So having those, the comfort level in those relationships was very, very helpful throughout this case. And as I said in the beginning, I talked about the team approach and that importance. Do you want me to go for it? But this is part of the, you'll see the things that they gathered for us and what made it very critical for Brian and then for Bob going forward in the investigation.
So another thing to say about BEAS investigators is it's really helpful because they're not really law enforcement. They don't carry a gun, they don't carry a badge or anything like that. So when people invite them in, alleged perpetrators, they're willing to speak a little more openly than they would be with someone like Bob or another investigator who goes. And I think that really helped us again here because it allows them to open up and kind of give some statements, some truthful statements about what they really did with the funds, and also some lies, but we'll see. So the one thing that he really did that helped this investigation was he had 2 separate interviews with the defendants. One in which he got some general explanations about, hey, where'd all this money go without the use of the bank statements? And then the second one where he asked specific questions and really held them to account for what they did with specific withdrawals and transactions. So he also interviewed a lot of other people in this investigation, which was really helpful for us identifying, okay, who do we need to follow up with and who do we not need to follow up with? So that was helpful as well. He didn't record the interviews, but he was very, very good about documenting each and every conversation that he had, both in his notes and also in these comprehensive reports that he put together. So we were able, again, to use that, and we actually called him at trial, and to the extent, he forgot anything that happened, he was able to refresh himself with the reports and the statements that they made. And ultimately, he made findings of exploitation, which did not come in at trial because it couldn't come in at trial, but it was helpful nonetheless, just because, in New Hampshire, we have a state registry where these individuals get added to, and so they can't be things like guardians for other individuals if there's a finding of exploitation on their record. So that's just good in protecting other individuals who could be harmed as a result. Finally, he did the referral to DOJ. Not that that was a question, but because I was working with him all along, but it was just helpful to have that referral come in. And some of the statements that were really helpful for us, especially when you consider the fact that James was on the account as a co-owner. So really the question that we had to answer at trial was, okay, what was the arrangement between them? Was this an arrangement, as he said later at trial, which contradicted himself, that she said we could have it all? No, because of their prior statements. Barbara was in control, not me. They were gifts, they were loans, we paid her back, which we showed that they didn't pay her back at all. Barbara controlled the money. It was her money herself. And that was huge for us to show that, listen, this was all of Barbara's money. There was none of James's money, even though he was on the account as a co-owner. He also tried to distance himself. He said basically, we didn't take over until August of 2013, once all the money's gone. And then we both held on to the debit card, so we were able to put that in both Karen and James's hand, and he confirmed that, we got the card to help Barbara out. So now it gets passed off to the DOJ, and everybody has done a great job. To that point, we just don't want to screw it up. And so, Bob's going to tell you a little bit about what we did in terms of gathering evidence and speaking to witnesses.
So again, I can just as far as what Brian was saying about APS and the investigator that actually did a fantastic job. And I know sometimes in whatever your business is, you have people that do a good job, and you have people who do an okay job, and you have people who do a great job. And I can't say enough about how Sean Driscoll, who handled this matter, did a great job. And as investigators in a case like this, where you're working closely with the state agencies, as a police officer, you have to walk a fine line because you don't want them to act as an agent of the police. You want them to do their job, do what you normally would do, and whatever information you gather, you can give to us, and we're going to run with it at that point. And like Brian said, people are more at ease, I guess, with somebody who's not law enforcement. They're more able to give you more information, and this is, I think, what really sank Karen and James Foley as far as that's concerned. So after getting this particular package, which included stuff from the Medicaid office, it was handwritten notes on bank statements that Karen and James had prepared as to what the purchases were, what they were for. We had the job of obtaining receipts to either verify or debunk what those particular purchases were. What was funny about it was, when you look at all these, you could tell when, at the beginning of this explanation, very detailed about what it was. Oh, it was this, it was that, we took it here. And then, I guess as the pages were turning on, and they're looking at all these purchases, they're trying to come up with some more stuff. They can't, and it just gets to be like what Brian said, hey, we just took her to Walmart, and she had a great time spending her money. So that was really interesting, and that was really, really telling about what what their explanation was. So also, based on information that we received from Summerhill, we were able to speak with witnesses there about their observations of the interaction between Karen and James and Barbara. We followed up again with the stepchildren to confirm that they weren't a recipient of any of this money that Karen and James had said they were, and then we went from there. So what's really kind of cool, Brian, do you want to show the next
Yeah,
slide?
the only other thing I would say is that in the investigation, we also wanted to take a look into the defendant's own bank records. records to see if any of those cash withdrawals were deposited into the defendant's bank records, and just to look generally and see, what they purchased, if that could help us out in any way. So we'll go ahead and kind of show you.
And what was interesting about that is that their bank records, they had no money. They were running in the negatives half the time, so it made a whole lot of sense as well. So, for example, here was a bank statement that they wrote out for a purchase of $79, and this was for Amazon Prime. I don't think Barbara knew what Amazon Prime was. Other than it was a river and that was it. So their explanation was so she would have free ship. Free ship for what? I mean, the woman didn't buy anything, so it was strange to begin with. So when we subpoenaed the Amazon records, this was purchases that Barbara apparently had made from her account. And this actually shows that it's actually for Karen, as you can see. But it's Barbara's number, her debit card and her bank account. And here are some of the items that were purchased as a result of that account. And if you kind of look on that, does that look like anything that a woman in an assisted living facility would be buying? Marshall's Pet Bandits Ferret Tree. Granite bitter apple spray for ferrets. I mean, I don't think there was any animals allowed at the facility, but...
No, she didn't have the ferret. James and Karen did, but they also bought a deluxe multi-level pet home. So that was important.
What was interesting about analyzing, again, this is just kind of a snapshot of the purchases that were made from Amazon, from Barbara's account. Out of the 93 purchases made, 3 purchases we probably could have associated with her. And again, it was one was a wheelchair backpack, side pouch for wheelchairs. Those were the only items that we were able to really. If push comes to shove, we'll give you that one. We'll give you 3.
Yeah, and the other one here is there's a stainless steel 12-piece kitchen set. Again, Barbara didn't have the kitchenette in her building, and she had pretty severe Parkinson's disease. She didn't cook for herself.
Okay. Here's another one. This was for a Shaw's purchase in Peterborough for $151.26, and their explanation was that they bought fruit and candy to make baskets for the staff. So what was interesting about this is that we were able to subpoena the records from Shaw's for this particular purchase and this particular date, and here it is. And again, this appears to be just a regular grocery list to me. I think the closest item that you can get for candy and fruit for baskets for the staff would be a jar of molasses here for $3.49. The most expensive item on this grocery list? It's really not groceries. It's a carton of cigarettes from Marlboro.
And Barbara didn't smoke. She never smoked. Her husband had smoked before he passed away. But James did. James Foley smoked. And so a lot of the Shaw's purchases that we saw, we got receipts for the other items. It was a lot of cartons of cigarettes, things like that.
And the other thing is following up with the facility staff about this. When we spoke with Mary Pat Jackson at Summerhill, the staff weren't allowed to accept any gifts. So the fact that the gift baskets were made for the staff is not true. Mary Pat did say that the staff did accept donations for a Christmas party, and that neither Karen, James, or Barbara had ever made any donation to the staff Christmas party at Summerhill. Okay, these are explanations for Bed Bath & Beyond from the Follies. One was for new bedding and curtains, another one was for mattress covers, new waterproof sheets, and pillows and mattress covers. So I don't know how much of the stuff this woman needed, but we can tell from talking with the staff that she never got any of the stuff. None of the stuff existed. So here is the receipt for that particular purchase. And again, we're talking kitchen items, another stainless steel cooking set, canister set, storage set, appears to be all items that the Follies would use and not Barbara. And what's really great about today's technology is that years ago, and I'm sure a lot of you probably remember when you went to the store, you got a receipt. You got a receipt that spit out of a cash register that was probably about this big, and it was printed with a price and like whatever the department was that the item was bought from, not detailed like we have here. And this is very, very important. And with the fact that this information can be kept for years and years and years, it's always available to you. So it's really a roadmap to your investigation when you have this information available.
The biggest item on there, obviously, is the 6-quart KitchenAid mixer for $360 that obviously Barbara would not be using. And I guess you could give them some benefit of the doubt, Karen and James, if on one of the receipts, new bedding or curtains showed up. But that wasn't the case. At no point did they ever purchase new bedding or curtains for Barbara.
Okay. And this is a really good slide to show as well. So there's 3 columns here. The first column is these are Barbara's purchases that she made prior to James being involved in the account. And again, as you can see, most of them were checks, most of them were charity. This is all she had. After James and Karen get control of her account, all of a sudden, all these items are popping up on Barbara's bank account statements. That's the second column. The third column is Barbara and James's bank account that they had at the time. So if you guys look over, you can see a lot of those match, which would lead one to believe that they were using Barbara's bank account and her money for their own.
Yeah, they really gave conflicting statements when they were interviewed by BEAS, basically saying, well, I didn't take over until August of 2013. She was in control of her own finances. This counters that. So really on the left column there, you saw where Barbara shopped beforehand. Fairpoint Communications, Divine Worship Parish, St. Jude, Ken's Appliance, Figgies Inc., that's Gift Baskets, Town of Peterborough. And then after they take over, that's where we see the retail spending in the middle column. And then it's just about all of the defendants' own spending for their own personal bank accounts. They're using her bank account as a personal piggy bank. There's no question they're involved.
And what's really outstanding about these particular slides and these visuals is that, explaining it, you kind of get it, but to actually see it, it's really powerful. And I'm sure you probably can all tell from looking at that.
So in terms of charges, so we gathered all the evidence and we were ready to move forward. So what we did is we ultimately brought 3 counts of theft against James and 2 counts of theft against Karen. 2 of those counts involved the same, the cash and the retail spending. So cash and retail spending for James. And then it was his alone for the $50,000 withdrawal. We couldn't really link it to Karen in any way. At that point, it was really him who went in the bank and withdrew the money. We have a financial exploitation law, and it's actually a very good thing. It was passed about a year before our unit was created. The problem that we had was that most of this occurred before it went into effect in 2015. So that's why we could only charge James with 1 Class B felony count of financial exploitation. Because one feature of our financial exploitation law makes it illegal for a fiduciary, a guardian, trustee, power of attorney, to take advantage of that and use property for their own purchase, their own self-interest and purposes. So what we did have was after James applies for Medicaid on Barbara's behalf, he can't help himself. And so her Social Security and her pension is still going into her account. So what he does is he continues to take money. So that's where the 1 count of financial exploitation was, because it was after the enactment date in January of 2015, he made 2 large cash withdrawals during that time period. So that made it a felony. So we were able to tack that on. So here is just what we needed to prove in terms of just the financial exploitation of an elderly adult piece. We needed to show that he breached a fiduciary obligation recognized in law, and that would be his status as her attorney, in fact, as the power of attorney. Under our statute, you can prove that either knowingly or recklessly. We charged it under both knowing and reckless. And then, unless authorized, he deprives, uses the financial resources of the elderly, disabled, or impaired adult for the benefit of someone other than that person, himself. The value was more than $1,000, and under the statute, they have to know or reasonably should know that the person is an elderly adult, which for us is 60 or older. I'll let Sunny talk a little bit about witness outreach.
So as I said earlier, we had to spend a lot of time working with our different witnesses and keeping them engaged over this long period of time as we were completing our investigation. So obviously the Bureau of Elder and Adult Services, their investigation was a huge, huge asset to us because they did such a very, very thorough investigation. But then we had to meet with them and meet with them and meet with them. As Brian said, we had, 8,000 pages of discovery, so this wasn't going to be a once-off 1 hour. So they had to spend a tremendous amount of time with us, and again, the Bureau were just very gracious about it. They gave time, they gave effort, and it also let us establish that rapport with them for the trial process. The Medicaid employee, same thing. This woman was so nervous. She was wonderful, but she was nervous because, she's never testified before, and suddenly she was going to be talking about her job and her qualifications and how she approached it. So again, we met with her again and again. We put many miles on our cars on this case, going out to the Peterborough area to meet with them and to Keene. So she was awesome. She got invested again with that work with these witnesses and with these victims. They became engaged. This woman actually stayed for the rest of the trial after she testified because she felt so sort of engaged in it. She wanted to see justice. She was outraged by what she'd uncovered. And so she actually became incredibly involved with the case and with us. And I have no idea what she'll do next because she sort of got the bug for the investigation aspect and was back at school while working and everything else as a mom and everything else. So I have no idea where she'll go, but she got the bug because of this case. And obviously then we had Bob, who was doing from the Medicaid fraud unit. Do you want to speak more to your investigation? I, by the way, was fascinated at trial on who would have thought you could look back 5 years for a Shaw's receipt. I was just fascinated by that. And it was hugely, hugely helpful, by the way, in trial to be able to put that in their face, and Sam will demonstrate that in a little bit. And again, the facility staff, we had to work with them, and we had to talk to them. And after I leave here today, I'll be in touch with Mary Pat to tell her that we'd done this and that Folly was the case, because she's still outraged. She's still horrified. And the facility, by the way, also, which we didn't mention earlier, even when Barbara ran out of money, and even though they had other options, they absolutely kept her till she died. She did not move, she did not leave there. And the facility, in working with the family, it started off at whatever amount of money they were to pay, and then she said, okay, well, we'll bring it down to like $2,500. And then there was still no money coming. And so the facility were really out a good chunk of money. Brian will speak to that again later. And then the family members, they were the best because they had been estranged from her pretty much for quite a while. And when we had them up, we talked to them, we kept them informed. And their biggest sadness was that their father would have been heartbroken. But when we spoke with them, we'd keep them informed, we'd keep them in touch, we kept them engaged. But when we would ask them about gifts, some of their lines were classic. One of the fellows said, oh God, she sent me a fruitcake. Does anyone eat fruitcake? I had to throw it away. She would absolutely be furious if she knew I threw away something. So those sorts of things were very helpful and very telling for us. We kept them engaged. I, in fact, got an email from one of the family members a month ago to ask me, where is it at, Sonny? Are we done? Because we're still in appeal. Where are we at? Where are we going? Is there any new news for us? So the work with all of these witnesses and keeping them engaged and keeping them informed ended up being very, very huge in this case. And they ended up just being, we of course benefited because they were all wonderful people. There was, by the way, a brother, which very interestingly, and for those of you who, well, all of you understand elder exploitation and abuse, he had become estranged from his sister because of his brother. His brother wouldn't allow him contact with the sister. So there was this other brother, Herb, who's still in touch also because we kept him informed throughout the trial and throughout the process, because he was so hurt by what had happened and so horrified by what had happened and felt some guilt that he hadn't been able to intervene and help. And again, it was his brother, James, managed to isolate Barbara from him and made him convinced that Barbara didn't want to see him and wanted nothing to do with him. So in all this exploitation stuff, all of you know about the isolation factor. So there's that one person they absolutely have to depend on. And it happened in this case. Barbara thought that James and Karen were it. They were the family. They were the only ones who would look out for her.
So now we had all of this evidence. As I said before, we had about 8,000 pages of discovery. How do you sort of boil it down and present it to a jury, which is tough in some of these paper cases because there's a lot of information that you need to get across. So we really did that in two ways. We prepared summary evidence that we introduced through Bob at trial, detailing all of the bank records. In these, I'll go through it here. We kind of just did it this way, which was to kind of simplify it a bit, put these in boxes, show how much she had during different time periods. So this was Barbara's accounts in September of 2011. She's got the $16,000 in checking, $5,000 in savings, CDs, almost $80,000 for total assets, $170,000 and change. We showed graphs that kind of, we had visuals that compared things. So you saw that first graph on the left earlier in the presentation where she had 90% housing, 8% medical, less than 1% retail, cash, and charity. So what we did was we did another graph and we compared the two. We put those on the same slide. After James takes over, now we're talking about 37% housing, 1% medical, we're talking 15% retail, we're talking 47% cash and bank withdrawals, and suddenly there's no charity. We broke down the different types of purchases that were made following James's involvement with the accounts. So he was a big automotive guy. He liked his hot rods. So there were a lot of purchases during that time period of about $2,500, different automotive, both retail shops in Hillsborough and online. And in terms of the trial presentation software, we'll go through a little bit at the very end because we have to kind of switch out the HDMI cord to do that. So I'll just finish the presentation, then we'll kind of show you a couple of the slides that were really helpful in bringing this to life for the jury. Sentencing. So after they were convicted, it took the jury about 2.5 hours, which is relatively quick for us. They were pretty convinced that they stole the money. So James was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in the state prison. There were additional sentences that were conditionally suspended, but that really he will have to serve 1 to 4 years in state prison. Karen, the same thing, 1 to 2 years in state prison. What was really important, and Sonny talked about this already, was keeping the stepchildren engaged. Because even though they had been estranged from Barbara for quite a long time, they were outraged about what was done to her by James and Karen. They were furious because they thought they left her in good hands. I'm sure if they would have known what would have happened or what had happened, they probably would have been more involved all the way through. And at sentencing, for me, this is probably my favorite quote, which was one of the stepchildren. She said to the judge, in asking that she impose a state prison sentence, this broke our hearts because it would have broken our father's heart. So the father would have been Barbara's husband would have been absolutely devastated by what happened to her. The other big thing here is that we were able to help out the facility a little bit. Now, I had no belief that the facility was just in this to get paid back. That never crossed my mind. Mary Pat Jackson's a fantastic person. But I also think that she was out quite a lot of money as a result of this. And so we asked that restitution be paid to the facility, and the judge granted that. The judge determined that Summerhill Assisted Living was a victim because they suffered direct harm as a result of James and Karen's crimes, and so the court ordered restitution. And so we kind of end where we began. These cases are extremely difficult, especially when you don't have a victim. Especially when the perpetrator has broad and sweeping powers under a power of attorney and a co-owner on a bank account. But with all those problems and obstacles, it's still important to work together, use a team approach to investigating these, because as the judge said in sentencing, she doesn't believe that Barbara would have ever wanted to die owing anybody a cent. And I think that's probably true. So let me just real quick, we'll just show you a little bit how we presented the receipt information to the jury.
And as you can imagine, these cases aren't, you're trying to keep the jury engaged, and you're talking numbers and dollars and money, and you all glaze over after a while